A teen mocked a homeless vet. Stallone sat beside him. In silence. Welcome to Stallone Unleashed. Let's uncover what really happened. The city library, a grand, aging edifice of marble and oak, was a sanctuary of hushed reverence, its air thick with the scent of old paper and quiet contemplation. Elias Thorne, a man whose own spirit felt most at home in such places, sat at a long, heavy table in the main reading room, a stack of historical journals before him. He was a writer, a historian, a man who spent his days sifting through the forgotten narratives of the past, seeking the quiet, often overlooked truths of the human condition. His presence, in a worn but well-kept tweed jacket, was as unassuming and timeless as the leather-bound volumes that surrounded him. In his pocket, his fingers idly traced the smooth, cool surface of a small, intricately carved wooden compass, a gift from a long-lost mentor, a man who had taught him that true north was not just a point on a map, but a moral bearing, a commitment to integrity and compassion. His attention, however, was not on the faded script of the journal before him. It was drawn to a quiet drama unfolding a few tables away. An older man, his clothes clean but threadbare, his face a roadmap of a life lived with hardship, sat staring at a book, though his eyes, the color of a faded winter sky, seemed to be seeing something far beyond the printed page. There was a profound, almost unbearable, sadness in his gaze, a quiet sorrow that seemed to create an invisible, isolating aura around him. Elias recognized him as a veteran, not from any uniform, but from a certain disciplined stillness in his posture, a stillness that was at odds with the almost palpable tremor in his hands. A group of teenagers, their voices a little too loud for the library's hushed atmosphere, sat at a nearby table, their attention focused on their phones, their laughter occasionally breaking the reverent silence. One of them, a boy with a shock of artificially blonde hair and a sneer that seemed to be his default expression, looked over at the veteran, then leaned in and whispered something to his friends. They all looked, then snickered, their gazes a mixture of contempt and a cruel, youthful amusement. The veteran, whose name Elias did not know, seemed to shrink under their collective gaze, his shoulders slumping, his head bowing slightly, as if to make himself smaller, more invisible. He didn't react, didn't look up. He simply absorbed the silent, dismissive judgment, his face a mask of weary resignation. Elias felt a familiar stirring, a cold, quiet anger at this casual, unthinking cruelty. He had seen it too many times, this dismissal of the old, the poor, the different, this failure to see the human story behind the weathered facade. The wooden compass in his pocket felt heavy, a silent reproach. Just then, the veteran let out a small, choked sound, a sob, so quiet it was almost lost in the vast, echoing space of the reading room. He quickly raised a trembling hand to his face, as if to hide a shame he felt he had no right to display. The teenager saw it. The blond boy smirked, then mimicked the veteran's gesture in a grotesque, exaggerated pantomime, his friends stifling their laughter behind their hands. That was the final straw. Elias closed his journal, his quiet observations now demanding a more active, more direct response. He rose slowly from his chair, his movements deliberate, his gaze fixed not on the jeering teenagers, but on the solitary, weeping figure of the old soldier. He knew he could not let this stand. This was not just a matter of bad manners. It was a profound violation of a sacred space, a desecration of the quiet dignity that every human being deserved. The lesson, he knew, was about to begin. Elias didn't immediately confront the teenagers. He knew that a direct, public shaming would likely only entrench them in their arrogance, turning the situation into a spectacle that would further humiliate the veteran. His approach, as always, was more measured, more strategic. He walked slowly, deliberately, not towards the teenagers, but towards the table where the old soldier sat, his shoulders still shaking with silent, suppressed sobs. Elias pulled out the chair opposite the man and sat down, his movements quiet, respectful. The veteran looked up, startled, his eyes, red-rimmed and filled with a mixture of shame and a defensive wariness, meeting Elias's. He clearly expected a reprimand, a complaint about his unseemly display of emotion. Elias offered a faint, unassuming smile. He didn't speak. He simply sat, his presence a quiet, unwavering statement of solidarity, a silent rebuke to the jeering teenagers and the indifferent silence of the other patrons. The blond boy and his friends, their cruel game interrupted by this unexpected development, watched with a mixture of confusion and a dawning, uneasy curiosity. They had expected the old man to be ignored, or perhaps to be asked to leave by a librarian. This quiet act of companionship was something they hadn't anticipated, something their limited, cynical worldview couldn't immediately process. The veteran, whose name Elias would later learn was Arthur, continued to stare at him, his initial suspicions slowly giving way to a fragile, questioning hope. It had been a long time, it was clear, since anyone had willingly chosen to sit with him, to share his space, to acknowledge his presence without judgment. Elias reached into his satchel and took out a small, worn, leather-bound notebook and a fountain pen. He opened the notebook to a blank page and, with a steady hand, began to write. He wasn't taking notes, not in the conventional sense. He was simply creating a space, a quiet, focused activity that allowed the silence between him and Arthur to become less charged, less awkward, more of a shared, contemplative space. After a few minutes, Arthur's sobs subsided, replaced by a series of deep, shuddering breaths. He wiped his eyes with the back of a trembling hand. I'm sorry, he whispered, his voice a hoarse, broken sound. I didn't mean to make a scene. You have nothing to apologize for, Arthur, Elias replied, his voice low, calm, using the name he had seen on a library card peeking out of the man's pocket. Grief is not a scene. It is a part of the human condition, and it deserves to be treated with respect, not with mockery. Arthur looked at him, a flicker of surprise in his tired eyes. You saw them? He asked, his gaze flicking towards the table of teenagers, who were now whispering amongst themselves, their earlier bravado noticeably diminished. I did, Elias confirmed, and their behavior was regrettable, a testament to a profound lack of understanding, of empathy. He paused, then added, his gaze holding Arthur's with a quiet, unwavering compassion. But their ignorance does not diminish your worth, Arthur, nor does it invalidate your sorrow. Whatever its source, your pain is real, and it deserves to be honored. Arthur stared at him, a single tear tracing a slow path down his weathered cheek. But this time, it was not a tear of shame, but of a profound, cathartic relief. To have his grief acknowledged, his dignity affirmed, by this quiet, unassuming stranger, was a gift, a balm to a wound that had been festering in solitude for far too long. The wooden compass in Elias's pocket felt like a quiet affirmation. He had chosen his bearing, his true north. He had chosen compassion over indifference, connection over isolation. And in doing so, he had begun to shift the emotional landscape of the quiet, hallowed reading room. The group of teenagers, their earlier amusement now replaced by a palpable discomfort, began to gather their belongings, their whispers a mixture of defiance and a dawning, uneasy shame. They cast furtive glances towards Elias and Arthur, their bravado clearly punctured by Elias's quiet, yet powerful, intervention. The blond boy, the ringleader, whose name was Kevin, tried to maintain a semblance of his earlier swagger, but his sneer looked forced, his movements jerky, uncertain. As they got up to leave, Kevin deliberately bumped into Arthur's table, a final, petty act of aggression. A small, framed photograph, which Arthur had taken from his wallet and placed on the table before him, clattered to the floor. Kevin and his friends laughed, a harsh, nervous sound, then hurried away, their footsteps echoing in the suddenly silent reading room. Arthur let out a small, heartbroken cry and bent down, his hands trembling, to retrieve the photograph. The glass was cracked, a spiderweb of fractures obscuring the image within. Elias knelt beside him, his heart aching with a renewed anger at the casual, unthinking cruelty he had just witnessed. "Let me help you, Arthur," he said gently. He picked up the frame, his skilled, careful fingers assessing the damage. The photograph, though obscured by the cracked glass, was of a young man in a military uniform, his smile bright, his eyes full of a youthful, confident hope. "Your son?" Elias asked softly. Arthur nodded, his face a mask of profound, inconsolable grief. "Michael," he whispered, his voice thick with unshed tears. "He was killed. A long time ago, in the place most people have forgotten even existed." He took the broken frame from Elias, his fingers tracing the cracks in the glass, as if they were scars on his own heart. Today would have been his 40th birthday. The confession, so simple, so devastating, hung in the air between them, a testament to a grief that time had not healed, a loss that remained as raw, as immediate as the day it had happened. Elias now understood the source of Arthur's tears, the depth of his sorrow. He was not just a homeless veteran, a forgotten old man. He was a Gold Star father, a man who carried the heaviest, most sacred burden of all. "I am so sorry for your loss, Arthur," Elias said, his voice filled with a deep, genuine compassion. "And I am even more sorry that your grief was treated with such profound disrespect." He looked towards the now empty table where the teenagers had sat, a cold, hard anger solidifying in his chest. This was no longer just about a lack of empathy. This was about a desecration, a violation of a sacred sorrow. He helped Arthur back into his chair, then carefully placed the broken photograph on the table. "We will find them, Arthur," Elias said, his voice a quiet, unwavering promise. "We will find those young people. And they," he added, his gaze hardening, "will learn a lesson in respect, in honor, in the true cost of the freedoms they so carelessly, so arrogantly, take for granted." The wooden compass in his pocket felt like a cold, hard piece of steel, its needle pointing not just toward a moral bearing, but toward a necessary and just reckoning. Elias's first step was to speak with the head librarian, a stern but ultimately fair-minded woman named Mrs. Gable. He recounted the incident, his voice calm, factual, yet imbued with an undeniable moral authority. He spoke of Arthur's quiet grief, of the teenager's cruel mockery, of the final, callous act of knocking over the photograph of Arthur's fallen son. Mrs. Gable listened, her initial expression of professional concern deepening into one of genuine outrage. "This is unacceptable," she said, her voice tight with anger. "This library is meant to be a sanctuary for all members of our community, not a playground for bullies. And to disrespect a Gold Star father in such a way, it is beyond the pale." She immediately began to review the library security footage, her movements brisk, efficient. The images were clear, undeniable. The sneering face of Kevin, the mocking gestures, the deliberate bumping of the table. Mrs. Gable's lips thinned into a hard, determined line. "I know this boy," she said, her voice cold. "Kevin Albright. He's been a problem before. Arrogant, disrespectful. His father is a man of some influence in this town, a wealthy developer, which perhaps explains the boy's sense of entitlement." "Entitlement," Elias said, his voice quiet but edged with steel, "is no excuse for a lack of basic human decency." "Indeed," Mrs. Gable agreed. She quickly found Kevin's school records, his address, his father's contact information. "I will be speaking with the school principal on Monday morning," she said, "and I will be banning this young man and his friends from the library. Indefinitely." Elias nodded, a measure of satisfaction in his gaze. But he knew that a simple punishment, a ban from the library, was not enough. What was needed was not just retribution, but education. A genuine, heartfelt understanding of the profound hurt they had caused. "Mrs. Gable," Elias said, "I have a slightly different proposal. A punishment, yes, but also an opportunity. An opportunity for these young people to learn a lesson they will never forget." He then laid out his plan, his voice low, persuasive. He spoke of Arthur, of his quiet dignity, of his profound, enduring grief. He spoke of Michael, the son who had made the ultimate sacrifice. And he spoke of the importance of restorative justice, of forcing these young people to confront the human consequences of their actions, not just to be punished by an impersonal system. Mrs. Gable listened, her initial anger giving way to a thoughtful, appreciative respect. "Mr. Thorne," she said when he had finished, "that is a remarkable idea. A difficult one, perhaps, but just one, and a profoundly compassionate one." She picked up the phone. "Let me make a call," she said, a new, determined light in her eyes. "To Mr. Albright, Kevin's father. I have a feeling he will be receptive to our proposal, especially when he understands the potential public relations fallout of his son's regrettable behavior." Elias smiled faintly. He knew that sometimes the most effective path to a man's conscience was through his public image, his business interests. It was a cynical truth, perhaps, but a useful one. The wheels of a quiet, yet powerful, reckoning were now in motion. And Elias Thorne, the unassuming historian, the quiet champion of the forgotten, was at the helm, his course set, his moral compass pointing steadfastly towards justice, and perhaps even a measure of redemption. The phone call to Mr. Albright, the wealthy developer, was as effective as Elias and Mrs. Gable had anticipated. The prospect of his son's cruel behavior becoming a matter of public discussion, of a potential news story about a Gold Star father being mocked and harassed in the city library, was a powerful motivator. Mr. Albright, a man clearly more concerned with his public image and his business interests than with the moral education of his son, quickly, almost desperately, agreed to their proposal. And so, the following afternoon, a strange and unlikely meeting took place in a small, private conference room at the library. On one side of the long, polished table sat Arthur, his hands trembling slightly, his gaze fixed on the cracked photograph of his son, which he had placed before him like a sacred shield. Beside him sat Elias, a quiet, steadying presence. On the other side of the table sat Kevin, the blonde ringleader, and his two companions, their earlier arrogance now replaced by a sullen, resentful fear. Beside them sat Kevin's father, a man whose expensive suit and florid face could not quite conceal the angry, humiliated glint in his eyes. Mrs. Gable, the librarian, sat at the head of the table, a silent, authoritative arbiter. The air in the room was thick with a tense, uncomfortable silence. Mr. Albright was the first to speak, his voice a low, angry growl directed at his son. "I cannot believe," he began, "the shame, the embarrassment you have brought upon this family. To treat anyone, let alone a veteran, a man who has lost his son in service to this country, with such contemptible disrespect. It is beyond comprehension." Kevin flinched, but said nothing, his gaze fixed on the tabletop. "An apology is not enough," Mr. Albright continued, his voice rising. "There must be consequences. There must be restitution." He then turned to Arthur, his expression shifting to one of practiced, almost theatrical, contrition. "Mr. Hemlock, is it? On behalf of my son, my family, I offer you our deepest, most sincere apologies. And I would like to offer you some compensation for the distress my son has caused you. A gesture of our profound regret." He reached into his pocket and took out a thick, leather-bound checkbook. Elias felt a surge of quiet disgust. This man, he realized, understood the world only in terms of transactions of monetary value. He believed that even a wound as deep, as sacred, as Arthur's could be assuaged with a check. But before Elias could speak, Arthur himself raised a hand, a small, almost imperceptible gesture that nonetheless silenced the room. He looked at Mr. Albright, his faded blue eyes holding a quiet, unwavering dignity that seemed to diminish the wealthy developer, to render his expensive suit and his performative apology utterly meaningless. "I don't want your money, Mr. Albright," Arthur said, his voice a low, gravelly sound, yet carrying a profound, unshakable authority. "My son's life, my grief, they are not for sale." Mr. Albright stared at him, nonplussed, his checkbook hovering uselessly in his hand. Then what do you want?" he stammered. Arthur turned his gaze to Kevin and to the other two teenagers, who now looked up, their faces a mixture of fear and a dawning, reluctant curiosity. "I want you to listen," Arthur said simply. "I want you to sit here, and I want you to listen to a story. The story of my son, Michael. The story of the boy you never knew, the soldier you so casually dismissed as a loser. The challenge, so quiet, so unexpected, so utterly devoid of any demand for retribution or compensation, hung in the air, a profound, unsettling invitation to a different kind of reckoning, a reckoning of the heart, of the soul." The conference room fell into a profound, almost reverent silence. Mr. Albright, his checkbook still hovering uselessly, stared at Arthur, a look of utter incomprehension on his face. He was a man accustomed to solving problems with money, with power, with influence. The idea of simply listening was a foreign and clearly uncomfortable concept, but there was an undeniable authority in Arthur's quiet, dignified request, an authority that even a man like Albright could not easily dismiss. He slowly, reluctantly, put his checkbook away. Kevin and his two friends looked at each other, their expressions a mixture of apprehension and a strange, morbid curiosity. They had expected a lecture, a punishment, a demand for some kind of community service. They had not expected this quiet, personal, and deeply intimidating invitation to bear witness to another man's grief. Arthur took a deep, shuddering breath, his gaze fixed on the cracked photograph of his son. When he began to speak, his voice was low, hesitant at first, then gaining a quiet, steady strength as he delved into his memories. He spoke not of war, not of battles, or of politics. He spoke of Michael, the boy. He spoke of his first steps, of his first words, of his infectious, gap-toothed grin. He spoke of teaching him to ride a bike, of fishing trips to a quiet, sun-dappled lake, of the time Michael had found a baby bird with a broken wing and had patiently, tenderly nursed it back to health. He painted a vivid, loving portrait of a boy who was kind, who was funny, who was full of a boundless, optimistic energy, a boy who had dreamed of becoming a veterinarian, of spending his life healing animals. As he spoke, the image of the loser soldier that Kevin had so cruelly, so thoughtlessly conjured began to dissolve, replaced by the vibrant, living reality of a beloved son, a cherished human being. Elias watched the faces of the three teenagers. He saw their initial, sullen defensiveness begin to crumble, replaced by a dawning, uncomfortable empathy. He saw Kevin's sneer falter, then disappear completely, his gaze dropping to the table, his face a mask of a new, unfamiliar emotion, shame. Arthur then spoke of Michael, the young man. He spoke of his decision to enlist, a decision born not of any love for war, but of a deep, quiet sense of duty, a belief that he had a responsibility to serve, to protect, to stand for something larger than himself. He spoke of the letters Michael had sent home, letters filled not with bravado or tales of glory, but with a quiet longing for home, with a profound concern for his family, with a growing, unspoken weariness of the conflict that surrounded him. He pulled a worn, creased letter from his wallet, not the one he had given to Elias, but another, one he had clearly read 1,000 times. "I miss the smell of Mom's apple pie," he read, his voice thick with emotion. "I miss the sound of the rain on the roof. I miss just being home, but we have a job to do here, and I will do it. For you. For all of you. Tell everyone I love them. And tell Dad I'm trying to be as brave as he is." The simple, heartfelt words, spoken across a chasm of time and loss, seemed to suck all the air out of the room. Kevin let out a small, choked sob, which he quickly tried to stifle. The girl beside him was openly weeping now, her face buried in her hands. Arthur folded the letter carefully and placed it back in his wallet. He then looked directly at Kevin, his faded blue eyes holding not anger, not accusation, but a profound, heartbreaking sorrow. "That son," he said softly, "was the loser soldier you were mocking yesterday. That was my boy, my Michael." The quiet, devastating power of his words, of his story, had achieved what no lecture, no punishment, no monetary compensation ever could. It had forced these three young people to confront the profound, human reality of their own casual cruelty, to see the living, breathing, loving heart they had so thoughtlessly, so carelessly wounded. The silence that followed Arthur's story was absolute, a sacred, almost unbearable stillness. The only sound in the room was the soft, choked sobbing of the teenage girl, Jessica. Kevin sat frozen, his head bowed, his shoulders shaking. Even the stocky boy, Mark, who had seemed the most hardened, the most indifferent, had tears streaming down his face. Mr. Albright, the developer, looked pale, shaken, his usual air of confident authority completely gone. He stared at Arthur, at the cracked photograph of his son, with a new, humbled expression, as if seeing for the first time a world of sorrow, of sacrifice, that his own privileged life had never allowed him to comprehend. Arthur himself seemed to have retreated into his memories, his gaze distant, his hands resting protectively on the frame of his son's picture. He had shared his most precious, most painful story, had laid bare his heart, and in doing so, had delivered a lesson more powerful, more profound, than any of them had ever experienced. Elias, who had remained a quiet, unobtrusive presence throughout, knew that this was a pivotal moment, a moment of potential transformation. He waited for the raw emotion in the room to subside slightly. Then he spoke, his voice calm, gentle, yet carrying an undeniable weight. "What you have just heard," he said, addressing the three teenagers directly, "is a story of love, of loss, of a quiet, enduring courage. It is a story that deserves to be honored, to be remembered. And it is a story that you, through your thoughtless actions, have become a part of." He paused, letting his words sink in. "An apology," he continued, "is a necessary first step, but it is only a first step. True restitution, true learning, requires more than just words. It requires action. It requires a genuine effort to understand, to empathize, and to change." He then turned his gaze to Mr. Albright. "And you, sir," he said, his tone respectful but firm, "you offered to write a check. A gesture, perhaps well-intentioned, but ultimately an inadequate one. There is no monetary value that can be placed on a father's grief, on a son's sacrifice." He then laid out the proposal he and Mrs. Gable had discussed, a proposal for a different kind of restitution, a different kind of lesson. "The library," he said, "hosts an annual Voices of Our Community event where local residents share their stories. It is an event that celebrates the rich, diverse tapestry of our city's life. I propose that these three young people," he gestured towards Kevin, Jessica, and Mark, "work with Mr. Hemlock, that they listen to his story, to the stories of other veterans he may know, that they help him to craft a presentation, a tribute to his son, Michael, and all the other quiet heroes whose sacrifices have so often been forgotten, or worse, disrespected." He looked at the teenagers, his gaze challenging, yet also offering a path towards redemption. "I propose that you use your voices, your energy, your youthful perspective, not to mock, but to honor, not to tear down, but to build up. I propose that you become the guardians, the storytellers, of the very legacy you so carelessly insulted." The proposition hung in the air, audacious, unexpected, and profoundly, beautifully just. It was not a punishment, but an opportunity, a chance to transform a moment of shame into an act of service, of remembrance, of a deep, meaningful, and lasting respect. The room remained silent for a long moment as the three teenagers and Mr. Albright absorbed the weight of Elias's proposal. It was a challenge that went far beyond a simple apology or a punitive detention. It demanded time, effort, empathy, and a genuine engagement with the very world they had so casually dismissed. Kevin was the first to look up, his eyes red-rimmed, his earlier arrogance completely gone, replaced by a look of hesitant, almost fearful, hope. He looked at Arthur, then at Elias. You think he would want to do that?" he asked, his voice barely a whisper. "With us." Elias turned his gaze to Arthur, who had been listening to the proposal with a quiet, unreadable expression. "Arthur," Elias asked gently, "what do you think?" Arthur looked at the three young, tear-stained faces before him. He saw not the cruel bullies from the day before, but three frightened, remorseful children who had been forced to confront a painful, uncomfortable truth. He saw their shame, their regret, and perhaps a flicker of a genuine desire to make amends. He thought of his son, Michael, of his kind, forgiving heart. What would Michael have wanted? Not revenge, certainly. Not a continued cycle of anger and resentment. He would have wanted understanding. He would have wanted connection. He would have wanted healing. Arthur took a deep breath, then nodded slowly. Yes, he said, his voice a low, gravelly sound, yet imbued with a new, quiet strength. Yes, I would like that. For Michael, I would like his story to be heard. A collective sigh of relief seemed to pass through the room. Mr. Albright, looking profoundly grateful, and perhaps for the first time, genuinely proud of his son's hesitant step towards maturity, quickly agreed to provide any resources needed: recording equipment, presentation materials, transportation. The project was set in motion. The weeks that followed were a period of profound and often difficult transformation. Kevin, Jessica, and Mark began to meet regularly with Arthur at the library, under the quiet, watchful guidance of Elias and Mrs. Gable. At first, the meetings were awkward, stilted, the air thick with unspoken guilt and a lingering, mutual distrust. But Arthur, with a quiet patience and a surprising generosity of spirit, began to share his stories. He spoke more of Michael, of his life, of his dreams. He showed them other photographs, other letters, and he began to speak, hesitantly at first, then with a growing confidence, of his own experiences, of the quiet, often lonely, battles he had fought, both during and after the war. The teenagers, in turn, began to listen, truly listen. They put away their phones, they put aside their adolescent cynicism, and they began to see Arthur not as a homeless vet, not as an object of pity or scorn, but as a man, a father, a hero, with a story of profound depth and a heart of immense, resilient strength. They began to ask questions, not out of sense of obligation, but out of a genuine, dawning curiosity, a desire to understand. They helped Arthur to organize his memories, to find the narrative thread in his often fragmented recollections. They learned about history, not from a textbook, but from a living, breathing source. And in doing so, they learned about empathy, about respect, about the profound human cost of conflict, and about the enduring, redemptive power of memory. Elias observed this process with a quiet, profound satisfaction. He saw the walls between the generations, between the privileged and the marginalized, begin to crumble, replaced by a fragile, yet beautiful, bridge of shared understanding. He saw three young people, once so careless with their words, now learning to use them with a newfound respect, a newfound purpose. And he saw an old soldier, once so lost in his solitary grief, now finding a new voice, a new purpose, in the sharing of his story, in the honoring of his son's legacy. The Voices of Our Community event was no longer just a punishment. It had become a mission, a shared journey of discovery, of healing, of a quiet, profound, and utterly unexpected redemption. The night of the Voices of Our Community event arrived. The library's main reading room transformed into a makeshift auditorium, its usual hushed reverence replaced by a low, expectant buzz. The room was filled to capacity, a diverse cross-section of the community, parents, teachers, students, city officials, and a surprising number of veterans, their presence a quiet, supportive phalanx. Elias sat in the back row, a quiet, unobtrusive observer, his heart filled with a mixture of pride and a certain paternal anxiety. He watched as Kevin, Jessica, and Mark, dressed not in their usual teenage attire, but in simple, respectful dark clothing, took their places on the small stage. They looked nervous, but also determined, their faces imbued with a new, unfamiliar seriousness. Then, Arthur walked onto the stage, aided by a simple wooden cane that Elias had helped him acquire. He was wearing a clean, pressed shirt and trousers, a gift from Mr. Albright, but his true adornment was the quiet, unwavering dignity in his bearing. He sat in a simple wooden chair at the center of the stage, a single spotlight illuminating his weathered, noble face. The presentation began. Kevin, his voice clear and steady, introduced Arthur, speaking not of his homelessness, but of his service, of his sacrifice, of his profound, enduring love for his son. Jessica and Mark then took turns reading excerpts from Michael's letters, their voices, once so full of mockery, now filled with a deep, resonant respect. A slideshow of photographs, carefully curated by the teenagers, played on a screen behind them. Michael as a gap-toothed boy, as a proud young soldier, as a beloved son whose light had been extinguished too soon. The room was utterly silent, the audience captivated, moved, many of them openly weeping. Then, it was Arthur's turn to speak. He didn't use notes. He simply spoke from the heart, his voice, though still gravelly, carrying a new, profound authority. He told the story of his son, the story he had shared with the teenagers, a story of love, of loss, of the quiet, heroic battles of a soldier's heart. He spoke not with bitterness, but with a deep, abiding love. He spoke not of the horrors of war, but of the enduring power of memory, of the sacred duty to honor those who had made the ultimate sacrifice. When he finished, a profound, almost holy, silence filled the room. Then the applause began. It started with a single person, then grew, swelling into a thunderous, sustained standing ovation, a wave of respect, of gratitude, of a shared, communal acknowledgement of a story that had for too long gone unheard. Arthur sat in his chair, tears streaming down his face, but this time they were not tears of sorrow, but of a profound, cathartic release, of a dignity restored, a legacy honored. Kevin, Jessica, and Mark stood beside him, their own faces filled with a mixture of pride and a deep, humbling emotion. They had not just completed a punishment. They had participated in a sacred act of remembrance, and in doing so, had been profoundly, irrevocably changed. Elias watched from the back of the room, his own eyes blurred with tears. The wooden compass in his pocket felt warm, its needle pointing steadfastly towards this moment, this beautiful, redemptive culmination of a journey that had begun with a thoughtless insult and had ended with a profound, communal embrace. The lesson had been learned, the story had been told, and the quiet, heroic voice of a Gold Star father had, finally, been heard. The impact of that evening resonated through the community in the weeks and months that followed. The story of Arthur Hemlock and the 3 teenagers who had helped him share his son's legacy became a local legend, a powerful testament to the possibility of redemption, of intergenerational connection, of the healing power of storytelling. The library, under Mrs. Gable's guidance, established a permanent Veterans Voices archive, a project dedicated to recording and preserving the stories of local service members, ensuring that their sacrifices would not be forgotten. Kevin, Jessica, and Mark became the project's first and most dedicated student volunteers. Their earlier, thoughtless cruelty transformed into a passionate, lifelong commitment to honoring the stories of those who had served. Kevin, the boy whose sneer had started it all, discovered a surprising talent for interviewing, his newfound empathy allowing him to connect with the veterans on a deep, human level. Jessica, with her artistic eye, became the project's archivist, carefully curating the photographs and letters that were entrusted to them. And Mark, the quiet, stocky boy, found his calling in the technical aspects of recording and editing, his steady hand and quiet focus a perfect fit for the meticulous work. Arthur, too, was transformed. The validation, the respect, the sense of purpose he had found in sharing Michael's story had been a powerful medicine. With the help of a local veteran support group, a connection made through Mr. Albright's newfound sense of civic duty, he found stable housing, a small, clean apartment that he slowly, carefully began to make his own. He became a regular at the library, a beloved figure, often seen in a quiet corner, helping the teenagers with their archive project, his own stories, his own wisdom, a guiding light for a new generation. Elias, for his part, returned to his quiet life, his role as a catalyst now complete. He occasionally saw Arthur at the library, the two of them sharing a quiet cup of tea, a comfortable silence filled with a deep, unspoken understanding. He saw the profound, lasting change in the old soldier's eyes, the weary sadness replaced by a quiet, resilient peace. He knew that the wounds of Arthur's past would never entirely disappear. The echo of his son's loss would always be a part of him, but it was no longer a haunting, isolating ghost. It was now a shared memory, a legacy honored, a story that had found its voice, and in doing so had brought healing not just to him, but to an entire community. One afternoon, Elias received a small package in the mail. Inside was a small, exquisitely carved wooden compass, its needle pointing steadfastly north. There was a short, simple note attached. For a man who always knows the true direction. Thank you, my friend. From Arthur and from Michael. Elias held the compass in his hand. Its smooth, warm wood a testament to a friendship forged in the most unlikely of circumstances, a symbol of a journey that had begun with a moment of profound disrespect and had ended with a profound, enduring, and beautifully redemptive act of love. The bronze star on his desk seemed to gleam a little brighter, its silent story now intertwined with another, a story of a father's grief, a son's legacy, and the quiet, unwavering power of a single, principled voice to change the world, one heart, one story at a time.